Get to it from up there, down these few steps, and this was actually the floor level. So Frank made it a much bigger cellar, and he lowered the floor quite a bit. It is in this cellar that we have the most famous sighting of our Roman ghosts. So I'm going to dim the lights a bit for you, if that's okay. Now this happened in 1953. A young man called Harry Martindale was working in the house with a plumbing firm, and they were installing a boiler, some pipes. A little bit of the job had to be done below the floorboards. So young Harry, he was only 18, he was the apprentice, they sent him down to this empty old cellar by himself just to make some holes in the wall up there, just a bit above this false ceiling, a bit of later restoration work. So he came down by himself. He had with him quite a bright light because he'd be working down here. He put his light in that corner. At that time there was a bit of a trench dug along there, so he was able to foot his ladder in the trench, and up he went to work on the wall. He said sometime before lunch on his second day, he heard what he thought was a musical note, possibly a trumpet, he wasn't sure. He thought it was in this room, but of course that didn't make any sense. So he dismissed it as a noise from upstairs, and he just carried on with his work. Then he heard this noise again, a lot louder and a lot longer. But again he thought, well, it can't be down here, it's got to be upstairs, maybe someone's put a radio on. So again he carried on with his work. But then he heard it a third time, and this time it was really loud, and it didn't stop. And he was convinced it was in this cellar with him, which of course made no sense. He looked all around him, there was no one down here. But as he looked down to his right, just about level with his knees, he said he could see what he could only describe as the head of a Roman soldier coming out of this wall, blowing this old trumpet. Well, you can imagine he was absolutely terrified. He practically fell off his ladder. He ran into that corner. He sat with his back against the wall, and he watched as this soldier moved out of the wall and started to cross the cellar. Now initially he could only see it from the knees up until it walked through the trench. Then he could see feet, he could see leather sandals, leather garters. He said the soldier itself looked a bit dishevelled, grubby, unshaven, quite elderly for a Roman soldier. It was wearing a faded green tunic, a skirt made of leather straps. The only shiny bit of its uniform was its helmet with the feathers at the back, and of course it was blowing this rather battered old trumpet. As Harry watched, the soldier moved across the cellar and started to go out through that wall. At which point Harry might have left, but he couldn't, because immediately after the soldier came this huge black horse. Sitting on the back of it, another Roman soldier, looking weary, leaning forward a bit. The horse could only be seen from the knees up, as it were, until it passed through the trench. As the horse plodded across the cellar and started to go out through that wall, another two soldiers appeared, then another two, and they just kept coming. Harry said he counted well over 20 soldiers crossing this cellar, so he had a chance to study them. He said most of them were wearing these green tunics, the skirts with the leather straps, some of them carrying short swords on the right-hand side, which would be the Roman way, some of them carrying spears. Unfortunately, none of them were carrying any sort of standard or banner that might have identified who they were. But the thing Harry said frightened him the most about these soldiers was that these were not grey, misty, foggy figures as you imagine ghosts to be. He said it was more as if this wall had disappeared and these very solid people had walked out of it. So of course he was sat in his corner thinking, well, if I can see them, they must be able to see me. So he shrunk a bit against the wall, he waited for something to happen. They didn't appear to notice him, they just kept plodding across the cellar and going out through the wall. Eventually the music faded away and the last of the soldiers disappeared through the wall, and Harry sensed he was once again alone in this cellar. So of course he shot across the cellar, he ran upstairs, he sat down by the kitchen, he looked pale and frightened. His colleagues gathered around him. He started to tell them what he'd experienced, but as he told them he realised actually it sounded quite mad, and that they're going to think he's maybe drunk at work or just insane. So he told the people in the house on the day it happened, and then he didn't mention it again. He decided he would keep it to himself. He did decide he didn't want to work in any more cellars, so he left the heating industry. By the early 1960s, Harry actually worked in York Minster with the in-house police force, where he then worked until he retired. So Harry was working in the Minster in 1969 when they made that famous discovery I mentioned upstairs. They discovered the Roman ruins under the Minster and the Roman road under this house. So Harry thought, well, if there's a Roman road under that cellar, maybe there's something to what he'd seen down here all those years before. So this was when he told his story publicly for the first time. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of interest, and since then it's probably become one of the most famous ghost stories in England. At the time, a couple of archaeologists brought Harry down here to talk to him. They were pretty sceptical. They thought they'd spend a few minutes with him and get it out of the way. They actually ended up spending the whole day with him and late into the evening. They questioned him, they talked to him, they discussed what he'd seen. At that time, most people's idea of Romans would have come from the big Hollywood movies of the era, Ben-Hur, Cleopatra, not really known for their historical accuracy. But here was this young ex-plumber with no interest in history who didn't know about Romans, telling them really intricate details about kind of late period Roman soldiers. He talked about what they were wearing with the sort of detail they couldn't understand how he would have known. He did mention they wore green, and at the time it was thought that Roman soldiers only ever wore red or white. But every other detail he gave them seemed to ring true to them, as I say, about kind of late period Roman soldiers. So they decided that if indeed Harry had seen soldiers down here, maybe what he saw is what has become known as the Forgotten Army, the soldiers that were left behind as the Romans went into retreat. And of course they weren't getting supplies from Rome, so that might have explained why they were wearing green. We'll never know for sure what Harry saw down here, if he saw anything, but he's not the only person to have seen them. I mentioned Evie from 1920. In 1940 we had a city engineer working down here. He saw a Roman soldier in the main corridor. He actually thought it was a member of staff dressed up, but we have never dressed up as Romans in this house, so we don't know who he saw. In 1958 we had a housekeeper, a lady called Joan Mawson. She worked for us for a very short period, possibly because she actually saw the Romans down here on 3 separate occasions. Now, some of the sightings have had different details. They've talked about the soldiers. Joan saw them walking along the road, Harry saw them walking across the road, other people have seen them just standing in the corridor. But the consistent detail that everyone has always said is they talk about them as being solid people. We have to be honest though and say we haven't seen them recently. Now they do tend to be seen in February, and we are a National Trust property. We close from November to March. So they could be walking around here every February and we just don't know they're here. We have peaked occasionally in February because we've never seen them. There are lots of theories about ghosts, and one theory is that they have a kind of shelf life, an expiry date, and it is suggested that maybe, ours being some of the oldest ghosts ever seen in England, that they have finally just disappeared and we're never going to see them again. We don't know, and we leave it to all of our visitors for you to decide what you want to believe. A couple of interesting facts that have come up since Harry's day. The main one being that it was always thought that the Roman soldiers, as I said, only wore red or white. Well, in the last 15 years they have discovered that actually they did wear many different colours. And in fact 12 years ago on an archaeological dig in York they found a bit of Roman breastplate with green fabric attached to it, which very much bore out what Harry had talked about all those years ago. But the one fact about this story I always find interesting and makes it hard to dismiss is the idea that Harry talked about seeing the soldiers from the knees up until they walked through the trench. Now that is such a strange detail to put in, to make up if you haven't actually seen it. I mean, this was a young plumber just working down here. Why would he make up a story about Roman soldiers? But if he did, why would he say that he could only see them from the knees up? He did not know there was a Roman road down there at the time. Nobody did. And I just always think that is a strange detail to put in if it isn't something you've actually seen. But as I say, we'll leave that to you to decide. But that is the story about Romans in the cellar. So I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can go back upstairs again. Did you understand okay? Yes? Do you believe in ghosts? Maybe.